What if the most dangerous lies aren't whispered in secret meetings, but broadcast on primetime television, wrapped in the language of necessity and progress? In 2003, enhanced interrogation techniques became standard terminology across government communications and mainstream media. The phrase sounds clinical, almost therapeutic, but it described the same practices previous generations simply called torture. No conspiracy needed, just a linguistic makeover. But that's not the only example. When military operations result in unintended civilian casualties, officials often use terms like collateral damage, which can make the losses seem more abstract. When central banks create trillions of dollars out of thin air to bail out financial institutions, economists don't call it printing money to cover debt. They announce quantitative easing programs, making monetary manipulation sound like precise scientific procedure. Stanford psychologist Albert Bandura's research on euphemistic labeling reveals exactly how this works. In his documented studies, people were more likely to administer punishment to others when the action was described using clinical sanitized language rather than direct terms. The behavior remained identical, but sanitized descriptions allowed participants to psychologically distance themselves from the harm they were causing. This is one technique for hiding truth in plain sight, but there are others, and George Carlin spotted all of them decades before you did. The comedian who made us laugh was actually issuing warnings about the psychological warfare being waged on our ability to think clearly. His observations weren't just entertainment, they were prophecies about the world we're living in right now. George Carlin understood that authentic power doesn't announce itself with crowns and titles. Listen to what he said. It's called the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe it. He grasped that real control operates through what psychologists call system justification, our psychological need to see current arrangements as legitimate and necessary, even when they work against our interests. NYU researcher John Jost's studies reveal something remarkable. When people are told a policy is permanent versus temporary, they defend it more strongly. We don't just tolerate systems that harm us. We become their most passionate advocates when we believe we can't change them. Carlin saw this decades before the research confirmed it. He recognized that modern control doesn't come from forcing compliance. It comes from making people desperate to comply voluntarily. Consider the 2003 Iraq invasion. The Bush administration carefully avoided calling it regime change through military force, while describing efforts that functioned exactly like previous conquests. Officials branded it Operation Iraqi Freedom, with the Pentagon creating special programs allowing the operation to proceed under humanitarian language, essentially covering military objectives with liberation rhetoric. Now, compare this to the 2020 pandemic response. When massive corporations received hundreds of billions through the Paycheck Protection Program, with minimal oversight and widespread fraud, officials didn't call it corporate welfare. They branded it economic stimulus and job preservation. Meanwhile, individual citizens received limited direct payments described as government handouts that supposedly created dangerous dependency. Notice the pattern. Identical governmental mechanisms get completely different linguistic treatment depending on who benefits. The Iraq invasion used the same military strategies as previous wars, but calling it Operation Iraqi Freedom made it sound humanitarian rather than strategic. Corporate pandemic relief used the same wealth transfer mechanisms as traditional welfare, but framing it as stimulus made it acceptable while individual aid remained controversial. You don't need to fool people completely, you just need to make your preferred option seem like the least terrible choice among unthinkable alternatives. This is what Carlin meant by the illusion of choice, a psychological trap far more sophisticated than simple deception. Carlin didn't just complain about dishonest language, he dissected exactly how it rewires our thinking. His most famous example traced combat stress terminology. There's a condition in combat. Most people know about it. That condition used to be called shell shock. Simple, honest, direct language. 2 syllables, shell shock. Almost sounds like the guns themselves. Then he showed the transformation. After that, it became battle fatigue. 4 syllables now. Takes a little longer to say. Doesn't seem to hurt as much. Then, psychiatrists got their hands on it, and it became post-traumatic stress disorder. Still 8 syllables. We've added a hyphen, and the pain is completely buried under jargon. Each evolution served institutional interests, making human suffering more abstract, more clinical, more manageable for systems to process and dismiss. The soldier's agony remained identical, but the language made it easier for everyone else to look away. Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky's groundbreaking research reveals this principle in action. In their famous 1981 study, they presented identical medical scenarios to participants using different language. When a treatment was described as having a 90% survival rate, people strongly supported it. When the exact same treatment was described as having a 10% mortality rate, support dropped dramatically. The medical facts remained identical, but the linguistic framing completely changed people's emotional response and decision-making. This pattern saturates modern business practices. Cosmetic brands don't say they profit from making you feel unattractive. They talk about enhancing natural beauty. Social media companies don't admit they sell your life to advertisers. They frame it as data monetization. In both cases, the truth isn't hidden. It's polished until it feels harmless, even desirable. The transformation isn't accidental. Each euphemism serves a specific psychological function, allowing everyone involved, including consumers, to maintain comfortable distance from uncomfortable realities. When someone develops anxiety and depression from compulsive social media use, the platform's engagement optimization sounds technical and neutral, rather than predatory and harmful. Corporate executives genuinely believe they're solving problems and creating value because the language they use daily reinforces that interpretation. They're not lying to the public. They're using words that let them lie to themselves first. This makes the deception more believable because it's psychologically authentic from their perspective. Once you notice the language shift, you can't unsee it. Every industry develops specialized vocabularies that make morally questionable practices sound like technical necessities. The pattern becomes a roadmap for understanding how systems hide their true nature in plain sight, using words as both weapon and camouflage. This linguistic manipulation isn't uniquely American. It's a universal feature of power structures worldwide because the underlying psychology is human, not cultural. During the European debt crisis, Greek austerity measures weren't described as forcing economic hardship on struggling citizens. The European Union and International Monetary Fund spoke of structural adjustment programs and fiscal consolidation efforts. They weren't prioritizing bank profits over human welfare. They were restoring market confidence and ensuring long-term sustainability. Meanwhile, Greek unemployment soared past 25%, healthcare systems collapsed, and suicide rates increased dramatically. But the sanitized language helped European audiences and policymakers maintain psychological distance from the human consequences of their economic choices. China's internet censorship isn't sold as restricting freedom. It's framed as stability maintenance and social harmony. The same surveillance technology that would sound dystopian when described directly becomes reasonable when marketed as community safety infrastructure. The pattern transcends political systems, economic models, and cultural contexts because it exploits universal features of human psychology. Whether discussing authoritarian censorship, democratic austerity policies, or corporate exploitation, euphemistic language serves identical functions, reducing cognitive dissonance for implementers, maintaining public support through emotional management, and creating psychological distance between actions and consequences. This isn't evidence of global conspiracy. It's evidence that power naturally evolves towards psychological manipulation because direct coercion is expensive and unstable. When you understand the underlying mechanisms, you can recognize the patterns regardless of which language they're expressed in or which political system employs them. But here's what Carlin understood that makes this entire system possible. We're not just victims of linguistic manipulation. We're eager participants in our own deception. Cutting-edge neuroscience research reveals something disturbing about how our brains process threatening information. When people encounter data that conflicts with their existing beliefs, their analytical thinking literally shuts down. Brain scans show threat processing regions activating while reasoning centers go offline. Yale researcher Dan Kahan's studies on cultural cognition demonstrate that our ability to process numerical information drops significantly when correct interpretations conflict with our group identity. People literally become worse at analyzing data when the implications threaten their social affiliations. We don't just ignore inconvenient truths, our brains actively prevent us from processing them clearly. This cognitive defense system operates largely below conscious awareness. We genuinely believe we're thinking rationally while unconscious mental processes filter information to protect our psychological comfort. Consider how this plays out in modern online discourse. People spend hours debating content moderation policies on social media platforms, arguing passionately about free speech principles and community standards. But these debates systematically ignore how the same platforms are expanding surveillance technologies, building behavioral manipulation systems, and selling detailed psychological profiles to advertisers and political operatives. The content moderation discussion feels intellectually serious and morally important, but it distracts attention from much more consequential developments happening simultaneously. Users defend platforms that demonstrably harm their mental health, exploit their personal information, and manipulate their decision-making because they've built social identities and relationships within these systems. Acknowledging the platform's predatory nature would require confronting uncomfortable questions about personal choices and social connections. Climate change provides another clear example. Scientific evidence has been overwhelming for decades, yet meaningful systemic action remains limited. This isn't because people lack information, it's because them fully accepting the implications would require fundamental changes to how we organize economic activity, urban planning, and international relations. Our psychological defense mechanisms automatically search for reasons why the problem isn't urgent, why the information might be exaggerated, or why technological solutions will emerge without requiring personal sacrifice. As Carlin observed, I think people like to fool themselves. I think they like to live in these little fantasy worlds where they pretend things are okay. He wasn't being cynical. He was being compassionate. Facing reality consistently is psychologically exhausting, and most people need some degree of self-deception just to function in complex societies. The most effective lies aren't the ones contradicting obvious truths. They're the ones confirming what we're already motivated to believe. Leaders succeed not by convincing us to accept obvious falsehoods, but by helping us rationalize the falsehoods we want to accept anyway. Understanding this psychological vulnerability is essential for developing resistance to manipulation, because awareness of our own biases is the foundation of clearer thinking. Here's how all these tactics combine into a master strategy. Carlin warned, they don't want a population capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that. That doesn't help them. But he also observed, they keep the lower and the middle classes fighting with each other so that they, the rich, can run off with all the money. These aren't separate forces. They're coordinated parts of a sophisticated control system that uses euphemistic language, psychological blind spots, and manufactured controversy to keep power unchallenged. Your attention is finite. When you're locked onto one emotionally charged conflict, you can't track other events clearly. That's where strategic misdirection comes in. Political sleight of hand on a mass scale. Focus obsessively on bathroom policies and pronouns, and you'll miss what happened during the 2020 pandemic, the largest upward wealth transfer in modern history. Billionaires added trillions, while small businesses collapsed by the hundreds of thousands. Yet news cycles obsessed over mask mandates and lockdown protests. Officials didn't announce massive wealth redistribution to connected elites. They called it economic stimulus and liquidity provisions. The euphemisms didn't just hide the policies, they masked the entire shift in public focus. This reveals how the Overton window actually operates. Political scientists describe it as the range of acceptable public discussion, but they miss the key mechanism. Linguistic manipulation doesn't just reflect the window's boundaries, it actively constructs them. Take U.S. healthcare. From the first sentence, debates are framed in market terms: public options versus private markets, Medicare expansion versus consumer choice. Single-payer systems, used successfully in other nations with better outcomes at lower costs, aren't called efficient public administration. They're branded government takeovers or socialized medicine, making them sound dangerous before anyone looks at evidence. Media abundance amplifies the effect. Hundreds of channels serve up endless left versus right conflicts, celebrity scandals, and culture war drama. Corporate tax avoidance and regulatory capture, both shaping policy daily, get a fraction of the coverage. The volume creates the illusion of variety while keeping the conversation safely inside preset boundaries. Researchers call this pseudo-choice, apparent diversity masking uniformity. It's like a restaurant offering 50 ways to cook the same basic ingredient, while completely different cuisines aren't even on the menu. The genius lies in combining information overload with attention manipulation. People feel intellectually engaged and politically informed while never encountering genuinely transformative alternatives. The same euphemistic language that hides individual policies also polices the boundaries of acceptable discussion, creating a closed loop where even apparent dissent serves the system's stability. Issues generating the most emotional heat are systematically the ones posing the least threat to existing power structures. Cultural battles make people feel like they're fighting for something meaningful while leaving fundamental arrangements completely untouched. The magician's hand creating the distraction becomes more important than the hand performing the actual trick. So how do we escape these psychological traps? Carlin's approach combined humor with practical wisdom anyone can apply immediately. First, develop emotional awareness around information consumption. Notice when news or content makes you feel immediately comfortable or immediately outraged. Both reactions should trigger skepticism. Truth usually lives in complicated middle ground that doesn't produce strong emotional responses. When something feels too good to be true or too terrible to believe, step back and ask who benefits from that emotional reaction. Second, practice asking forbidden questions. The most important taboos aren't about personal behavior. They're about economic assumptions and power structures we're taught to accept as natural laws. Try these questions with current events. Why do we organize work this way instead of other proven alternatives? Who decided these should be our priorities rather than addressing different problems? What would this situation look like if we prioritized human well-being over profit maximization? Which voices are missing from this discussion entirely? Third, follow financial incentives rather than stated motivations. When confused about why something is happening, ask who benefits economically from the current situation. This won't give you all the answers, but it will point you toward much more revealing questions than the ones dominating news cycles and social media feeds. Most importantly, recognize that institutions benefiting from confusion and division need us to stay confused and divided. The mere act of understanding this dynamic is the first step toward transcending it. Once you can see the game being played, You can choose whether to keep playing by someone else's rules. But individual awareness alone isn't enough. Real change requires collective action, and that means finding ways to share these insights with others without triggering the same psychological defenses we've been discussing. Start conversations by asking questions rather than making declarations. Help people notice patterns rather than telling them what to think. Support independent media and researchers who are asking the questions mainstream outlets avoid. Real transformation starts with changing where you direct your attention. Every moment you spend arguing about manufactured controversies is attention unavailable for understanding how power actually operates. This isn't about becoming cynical or disengaged. It's about becoming more carefully engaged based on your own values, rather than accepting someone else's agenda about what deserves your mental energy. The goal isn't perfect clarity. It's developing resistance to manipulation by understanding how these psychological systems work. Once you can recognize the patterns, you can make conscious choices about how to respond, rather than simply reacting based on programmed triggers. Remember enhanced interrogation techniques from the beginning? Now you understand it wasn't just euphemistic language. It was a perfect example of hiding truth in plain sight through psychological manipulation. The information was public, the practices were documented, but the words transformed torture into something people could psychologically accept. That's the game being played on your attention every single day. Carlin saw it coming because he refused to look away from what was already happening. He understood that real power doesn't need to hide. It just needs to make itself invisible through the very systems we've been exploring. What made Carlin dangerous wasn't his anger or cynicism, it was his clarity. He could see through comfortable lies because he was willing to sit with uncomfortable truths. That same clarity is available to anyone willing to develop it. But awareness changes everything. Once you can see these psychological mechanisms at work, you can make conscious choices about how to respond, rather than simply reacting based on programmed triggers. You can choose where to direct your attention based on your own values, rather than someone else's profit margins. The conversation continues with you. In the comments, share one euphemism you've spotted that hides an uncomfortable truth. What language have you noticed that makes something questionable sound reasonable? And if you know someone who'd appreciate seeing these patterns too, share this with them. Your observations can help others develop the same clarity Carlin was trying to give us all along.